To talk a bit more about the situation in Kyrgyzstan with me now, let's bring in Mirha Rittmann. You're a researcher at Human Rights Watch, also a specialist in Kyrgyzstan, joining us live from Istanbul. Mirha, why, first of all, explain to us why the Electoral Commission canceled the results of that election from Sunday?
Well, if we take a step back to the vote itself, the vote took place amidst credible allegations of vote buying by pro-governmental parties. So after the results of the parliamentary vote were announced, showing that only one opposition party barely passed the 7% threshold to gain seats in parliament, a dozen opposition parties demanded that the election results be annulled and that a new election take place. And they called for protests on Bishkek's central square, Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan. By some estimates, several thousand people joined those protests on Monday and supported the demands of the opposition. And by the evening that day, the Central Election Committee had announced that it, in fact, decided to annul the elections and that new elections would be held at some point in the future.
The demonstrators that you were mentioning there who came out en masse after the announcement of the results, the initial results of the election, those protests were so big. How did they get organized so quickly?
Well, I think everybody's eyes were on the election outcome. And so when the pro-governmental parties won the majority of election, it was quite easy to garner, to seize the discontent amongst the people and call for protests, and people came out. That's, several thousand people came out that day, and I think that was in response to expecting more from the parliamentary vote. And the outcome of that election.
But now that those results have been annulled, will the protesters be satisfied, or could there still be protests going on around the country like we have been hearing?
Protests do continue. There are multiple political factions now making claims on power. And so the situation remains very uncertain and very volatile, and it's not clear who will come out on top. So indeed, protests will continue, I think, for the foreseeable future, although maybe not in the numbers that we saw on Monday.
Are you surprised to see this kind of protest, this violent protest happening in Kyrgyzstan? Kyrgyzstan, after all, is a country that does have a reputation of being one of the more stable and democratic countries in Central Asia.
In fact, this is the third time that people have taken to the streets to make demands and to try and force a change in government. The first time was in 2005. And then again in 2010, and both times led to the ouster of presidents. So protests are actually quite common and can be an effective way of voicing opinions and views and calling for political change in Kyrgyzstan. The protests, in fact, have not been very violent compared to the previous occasions that I mentioned. We did document that police resorted to force on Monday evening when some in the crowd tried to break through the gates to the White House, where the president and the parliament sit. But there haven't been mass arrests, and there's been one reported death and over 150 people that have sought that have been hospitalized in connection with the violence. So there were altercations with police, but fortunately, in the last 24 hours, we haven't seen a total breakdown, which is very good, and we hope that it will stay that way.
Mirha, that was going to be my last question. How do you see this situation playing out? Is this something that Kyrgyzstan can resolve domestically, or does it need international intervention?
I'm not sure how it will play out, but and Human Rights Watch has called on those in power to uphold fundamental rights in responding to the political crisis. I believe that there are many people on the ground in Kyrgyzstan that are trying to address the situation so that it doesn't spiral out of control. And I hope that we will see a resolution soon so that this power vacuum isn't left lingering for too long. So yes, I hope soon that we will see a resolution.
Mirha, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Mirha Rittmann, they're a specialist in Kyrgyzstan from Human Rights Watch.